Your stories live or die based upon the power of the characters. If the characters in your story are interesting, believable, something that gets people thinking, then people aren't going to pay any attention to what you have to say. Then the story you worked so hard to develop and build will just fall apart. And that's what happens for too many speakers. They create this story, they put this story together, it seems pretty good, but it just falls apart. Somehow, it isn't believable. Somehow, it isn't interesting. And the audience loses connection. If you've ever given a speech that involved a character, or involved characters, maybe you've noticed this. The audience starts out listening, and then gradually, as they listen to what you're saying, they just kind of pull away until it seems like there's nobody in the audience at all. The whole audience is just kind of faded away, and they're gone. It's because the story wasn't compelling, wasn't involved, wasn't interesting. Today you will learn the 3 things you need for your character. 3 things you need to make your characters come alive. And the 3 things that often are left out. Because we have these senses. We have 5 senses. Some say 6, some say 5. Everyone can agree we have 5 senses. And these 5 senses need stimulation even when you're talking. Even when you're telling a story. Especially when you're telling a story. Always aware of these 5 senses, so they need to be stimulated and excited. Stories are great because they give us a chance to actually see what's going on. The audience should see something that they're interested in. It's important to understand who all these people are. And all too often, people don't. They don't understand what's going on, don't understand the story, things aren't explained well, or if they are explained well, it just somehow doesn't work. And speech is not a book. A book is not a speech. And yet all too often, speakers make that mistake in thinking that all they're doing is simply reading a big book out to their audience, a captive audience. And the audience has to just sit there and listen to everything they have to say. Just as when you're reading a really boring book, you have to go through page after page after page till you finally put it down. The thinking is, well, they can't put my speech down, they can't put me as a presenter down, so I'm just like a book that they have to read. As long as I'm talking, they got to pay attention. Just like they're leafing through a book. As long as that book's in their hand and they're reading through it, whether they like it or don't, they still have to keep going through the book. However, speech is not a book. And many speakers find, to their surprise, the audience can, and does, metaphorically set them aside and decide they don't want any of that. Unlike a book, which when you're reading, you have to pay attention to it, the speech, perfectly capable of having somebody talk on and on and on, and everybody just ignores them. And that's sad. It doesn't need to be the case. A speech which has a story in it can be engaging, exciting, entertaining, and should pull the audience in. People should want to know more. Should want to be interested. Stories hook people. And they only hook people if you make sure that you're doing these 3 things. Very important, often forgotten. So today we're going to talk about the 3 things you really need to do when you're telling your story to make your characters come alive. Story is all about the strength of the characters. Powerful characters tell a powerful story. First thing to keep in mind is that your character must be seen. Your audience has to have in their head a picture of this person. A picture as real and as substantial and as three-dimensional as if that person was standing right in front of them and they were looking at them from head to toe. Character has to be seen. It has to be seen inside the audience's mind. Now the thing about that is quite often what people think that means is that they should just throw in a lot of details. So they start adding in a lot of details. Tom Jones was 6 feet 4 inches in his heels, and he strode the earth strongly. He had flaming red hair, a gap tooth, long sideburns, hairy whiskers, and it goes on and on and on. And the person who's trying to tell this great story just piles all these details in as if the speech was a book. As if the speech was some sort of book where describing and fleshing out all these details of this character. However, speech is not a book. A speech is an opportunity to engage the audience and get inside their mind. So if you really want people to picture a character in a vivid sort of way, in a way that's just going to stand out in their head, get your audience to picture a character they already know. In order to make the character vividly seen, only put in the essential details. If it's really important, you need to know the guy is tall, mention this is a tall guy. If you need to know he's strong, mention that too. Joe is a tall, strong guy. A big guy. Now that will mean something different to everybody in the audience. Everybody in the audience will have their own idea of what a strong, tall, big guy looks like. What hair do they have? How do they dress? And the great thing about that, it means that everybody in your audience will have their own unique picture of your character. And each one will have their own picture of the character in such a way that best connects with them. Basically allow your audience to customize the character so it best fits with their interests. On the other hand, if you start piling a whole bunch of details, somewhere along the way the audience person is going to say, it just doesn't match with what I have in my head. It just doesn't seem real to me. I just don't buy that. So too many details can be a bad thing. If you want your character to be seen, only put in the essential details. So if he's an angry person, he should be angry. We'll talk later on about how to make him appear angry to your audience. How to bring out the character's emotions. For right now, you just want the character to be seen. Seen vividly in the audience's mind. Just pick out the most important features that that character should have. And that's it. Give the character a name. Tell a little bit about them. And that's it. So if you have a guy, Joe, and Joe is meant to be kind of a bully, say Joe is a big guy who likes to throw his weight around. That's enough. Different people have different ideas of what that means. Or Joe is a big guy who knew how to use his bigness. That's enough. We'll talk later about how to make that really come out to your audience in an important way. Because there's something that people often don't think about with their characters when they tell stories. Even though people have this in real life, when it comes to having a character, people completely forget about this. We'll talk about that next. Character needs to be known. You have to understand where these characters come from. there has to be some sort of background there. If there's no background, there's no character. You ever hear a story about somebody, Tom, walking down the street, and Tom does this sort of fabulous thing and it leaves this other thing going on in his life? And the whole time you're thinking, who is this Tom guy anyway? Why is he walking down that street? What's his history? Where does he come from? And all too often, you'll get no answer, no reply. Works the same way for your audience. Your audience is out there, they want to know who those characters are. And if you don't have an answer, they give up on it, they forget about it. Doesn't matter. Doesn't touch them. The character isn't known. If they don't know the background of that person, they don't care about them. Think about, take a little bit morbid one here, think about death. People die all the time. It happens. It's horrible, but it happens. Just the way it is. Part of life. And if you notice, if you know somebody, their death hits pretty hard. You don't know them, too bad. If you do know them, that's difficult. And the ones you know the best are the ones you feel for the most. Your mother, your father, your close relatives. These are the deaths that tend to hit people the hardest. Because they're known. So they touch the person. They're unknown, it happens. Sad, but it happens. Same thing with your stories, same thing with the characters in your stories. The audience doesn't know who they are, what they're doing. They won't understand why they're doing the stuff they're doing, and they won't care about it. It just won't matter. It'll be like one of those people passing away they don't know. It's like, oh, well, that's the way it goes. And if it's a personal story for you, and you're telling this story, there's a tendency to say, well, of course they should care. Hey, it's about me. They should care. And if it's a personal story, it's very likely you've left a lot of details out because you know them really well. Problem is, your audience doesn't. If you're telling a personal story, make sure you get all that background information. Here's a simple way to do it. Just tell your story to a friend. Don't tell them you're making any sort of formal speech or presentation. Just say, oh, why don't you listen to a story? And at the end of the story, ask them, do you have any questions? And if one of their questions is, who is this person and where did they come from? You'll know that your character is not known. So important to get a character to be known. To get people to really get a sense of who that person is. It means it has to be a real person. Just like every real person, they've got a background, they've got a history. And that history will drive them and get them to do things. If you have a history of a person who is angry, always angry, and they've been bullying and bullied all their life, that's important to know. Once you understand that, you start understanding how this person can deal with anger issues. If you've got a person who has a background of having a whole history of people who gamble, who spend money and they can't stop, then when you talk about a person trying to deal with a gambling addiction, then it makes sense. Then we get it. There's a whole history behind this person. We know them. There are different ways to make people known. Simple ways to say just where they came from. Bob came from a family of gamblers. And his dad lost the house, car, and his wife all in one day. And Bob was a gambler. But he wanted to stop. Well, now at least you know something about Bob. It's not just anybody. It's a guy who has this history. There's something to know. So always remember, you got to make sure that you know the characters. And there's one more thing you need if you're going to really make that character interesting and exciting, and somebody your audience cares about. One more thing you want to keep in mind. And finally, your characters should be heard. There should be some way your audience can hear what's going on. All too often you'll create a character and you discover you'll say things like, then there's a long discussion and they had an argument, and at the end of that argument, Bob's life was transformed forever. What was the argument? What did they say? How did it transform Bob's life? It's so easy to collapse all of that stuff and just leave everything out. And yet in all that stuff is the heart of your story. Whenever you find yourself in a situation where you're describing dialogue rather than telling dialogue, tell a dialogue. Instead of, my mother always said, change it to, my mom says, whatever. My mother always told me, be careful and not to go out, stay out too late. Change that. When my mother says to me, Tim, be careful, and remember, don't stay out too late. Notice the difference? One of them, the first one is about, hey, it happened, it's in the past, it's not live, it's dead. No one cares. The other one, it's immediate. It's right in front of you. It's happening right there. That's the beauty of dialogue. Dialogue drives your story. Dialogue is your story. Sometimes you'll have to narrate things. For instance, you can't very well have a speech and expect people to understand that the character is 3 years old. But beyond that, don't really need to say too much. The character is 3-year-old and she's angry. Well, the character is 3-year-old and said, I want my way! Now! Angry. And another thing about dialogue, be careful about having kiddie dialogue. Nobody wants to hear, hi, Mommy, how are you doing? Hey, Mom, I'm doing really fine. You hear that sort of thing sometimes. And if you're like me, a little annoying, and if you like it, well, other people probably don't. In general, unless you're some sort of really, really good mimic and have perfected the art of imitating somebody else's voice, don't. In a dialogue, you got an older person, maybe make it just a little bit older sounding, a little creakier perhaps. Don't go crazy. Maybe somebody speaks really slow and somebody speaks more quickly. That's a simple way to change things up. But be careful about making funny voices, because that very soon will get annoying to your audience. And instead of focusing on, funny voices, focus on what the voices are saying. You see, dialogue drives conflict. If you've got a good dialogue going back and forth, you can get some good conflict going on. Different ideas, different thoughts. Dialogue is two people on opposite sides talking back and forth. And it's important to drive conflict to drive your story. Dialogue drives your story because dialogue will drive the conflict. It'll make your whole story come alive. People will see it, the story being talked out in front of them. They'll hear the story right in front of them, right there. And that immediate effect, pull them in and get them interested. Always make sure that your characters are heard. Make sure the audience is all the time listening to see what's going to happen next. Use that dialogue to drive the conflict, to build the tension up to your exciting climax of your story. Without that dialogue, there's no story. There's just a bunch of stuff that happened in the past. She said, he said, whatever, no one cares. But he says, she says, he says, she says, he says, she says, boom! Climax! Now that's the story. Remember, final thing is making sure your characters are heard. So there you have it. Simple 3 things you need to have to develop your characters in your story. You have a character, characters have to be seen. Just like in real life, when you see somebody, you see them. You see how tall they are, whether they walk with a limp, whether they don't. You see them. When you tell your story, it's the same thing. Your audience should see that character, be like them coming up to them in real life and talking to them. You should feel that they're just bumped into that person walking down the street. They see them, they know them. And you do that by giving just the details that you need to have in the story. Let the audience fill in the rest. They'll have a rich character they really see, and that'll be different. For each person in the audience will see it a little bit differently. And they all will see it. You have to make sure your character is known. Just like in real life, you're telling a story, your character has to have a history. People come from somewhere. People don't just magically appear out of nowhere. It's like, poof, there you are. Hey, instant person, no background. In fact, if you ever find a person who seems to have no background, you might want to be careful. Maybe they're in witness protection or something like that. No. Everybody who's on the up and up has a background. Some background there. Same thing with our stories. Same thing with your story. Your story has to have a background. It has to come from somewhere. The character has to come from somewhere. And it's your job in the story to make it clear where that place is from. If a person is in college and they came from a rich background, they got a lot of money, they're wealthy, they're very influential, that tells you one thing. The person is college and parents didn't have that much money. The person wasn't considered smart in school and struggled for every single grade they got. That's a different story. Background is very important. Make sure your character is known. And finally, make sure your character is heard. Dialogue. Stories happen through dialogue. Just like in real life. It's when we're talking back and forth with someone that there's a story. If everyone's just sitting around and thinking about stuff, not much of a story. It's not that interesting in real life. It's not that interesting when you do that in your story you're telling in front of people. Something needs to happen. There needs to be a conflict, a problem, something going on. And that conflict comes out through dialogue. Do this. No, I won't. Do it anyway. You can't make me. Well, I'm going to try to make you. And you build that conflict back and forth as each person is talking. Conflicts build your story. Conflicts develop your story. You do that through dialogue. A back and forth dialogue, and a lot more interest and a lot more zest to your story than just talking about, well, someone said to me that they said this thing, and someone else said this thing. The other day I heard somebody said to somebody else something, and no. Make it real. Make it real life. They're talking to you right now. Bob said to Mary, Mary, do this. Mary said to Bob, Bob, I can't. Bob to Mary, why can't you? Conflict develops the story, and conflict comes out through dialogue. Make sure your characters are heard. Stories are powerful. Make a point, tell a story. Make another point, tell another story. And if you're going to have a good story, you're going to have good characters. When you develop the characters. Today you heard about 3 essential things your characters have to have. 3 things your characters really need. That they must have if you're going to have your story take off. Make sure your characters are seen, known, and heard. When you give that story in front of your audience, they'll be excited, they'll be riveted, and they'll be focused on the point you're making in that story.